I want to talk about your color correction workspace. Now, when most folks talk about color correction workspaces, they talk about the physical workspace. And in an ideal world, you would have a perfect color correction workspace. You'd have a great monitor that's been color calibrated. You'd have neutral color gray walls. You'd have perfect lighting with no sunlight coming into the room. And I doubt that anybody out there has that who's just doing some basic video editing. So that's okay, because we're going to work with scopes inside Premiere Pro. And where our eyes might fail us, our scopes won't. So don't sweat the physical environment all that much. If you've got a reasonably good monitor, you're probably going to be okay. But let's talk about the Premiere Pro workspace. So to follow along, open up the Working Files, Projects, and go to 1102 Color Workspace. Now this is not the Premiere Pro Color Correction Workspace. This is the standard editing workspace. I want to get to that other workspace from here, which is probably what most folks will do. So here we are. We've got this one clip on one sequence inside the editing workspace. First order of business is to go to the color correction workspace. It's not some magical thing, but it does rearrange things a little bit to make it more efficient when you do color correction. So go Window, Workspace, Color Correction. What happens is that you get this big effect controls area over here because you're going to need this space to do some of the work in the color correction effects. I'll click on that just to show you that there are the effects. When you add them here, they'll start showing up over there. The effects panel itself is right next to it, which would seem to be a little awkward because you need to go back and forth, but it's not that big of a deal because when you pick an effect here, you just double click it and it'll show up over here, then you pop over back here. It's fairly easy to go back and forth. What's interesting about this setup though is that you've got this extra monitor over here called a reference monitor. It's loaded up automatically, and if you would prefer not necessarily switching to the color correction workspace, you really will need to have the reference monitor open. So if you want to do that, you can always go Window, Reference Monitor, and click on that, and that will open it up here inside whatever space you're at. And it typically comes out as a floating panel, which you can then put inside a frame or let it still float around. Now, the next thing you need to do after the reference monitor comes up is to switch it over to the scopes. And we're going to look at the scopes in the next lesson, but let me show you how to switch to scopes. Every panel's got a drop-down menu here, a little panel menu in the upper right-hand corner. Click on that. Then you've got these various ways of viewing the reference monitor. Composite video is the same as what you see up here in the program monitor. So I'm going to click on all scopes just to show you the 4 scopes. We're going to work with these 2 only though, so don't get too concerned about the fact that there are 4 of these guys. We're going to work with just 2 when we do our color correction. Now the next order of business when you work with scopes is to make sure the scopes are ganged to the program monitor. What you want to have happen is that the scopes will give you a representation of what you see up here in the program monitor. So you need to gang the 2, and usually they're ganged by default. But to just check, click on this panel menu button here and make sure that the Gang the Program Monitor is checked. And if by any chance your transport controls are on, which they might be on by default, there's a little button down here in the bottom. If it's depressed like that, if you can see that it's dark gray around it, that means that you are ganged to the program monitor. In any event, whether it's open or closed, you can always go up here to check to make sure. I'm going to turn off the transport controls to give me a little more real estate down here. Now we're almost done here with the setup, and you could just stop doing things at this point. But I think it would be a good idea for you to create a custom bin to hold all the color correction effects we're going to work on in the next few lessons. You can create a new bin down here by clicking this button here, or just going to the panel menu out there and saying New Custom Bin. So if you make one of these guys, call it Color Correction or something like that. And what I want you to do is start putting some color correction effects in there. They're kind of scattered around inside the video effects categories, and so that's why I think it's a good idea to put them all in one place. And there are also way more color correction effects in Premiere Pro than you're going to need to work with. Let me just kind of give you an overview of those color correction effects and show you which ones I recommend you work with. Just open up the video effects here. Let's look at Adjust. These are all kind of automated effects. Color, contrast, levels, another levels effect here. ProcAmp has a lot of the stuff these guys have, but lets you adjust saturation, shadow highlight, similar. All the color correction oriented effects here I think are just not necessary. You don't need to work with them. I'd much rather have you work with effects that give you more control. So we're going to skip all those guys. No need to go to Blur and Sharpen or Channel, but here is the big guy, color correction. It's full of effects that are color correction oriented, but this is not the only place where they're color correction oriented effects. And of all these guys, there are only a few that you really need to work with. Again, some of these guys are kind of automated or there's sort of a narrow focus. It's better to work with the big guys and then work with all the various features within them. The number 1 effect to work with here is the Fast Color Corrector. I'll just give you a quick look at it by just double clicking on it and opening up over there. Here's the Fast Color Corrector. It has this color wheel and lets you control tonality right down here and a few other things as well. So your fast color corrector is kind of the go-to color correction effect. So I'm going to drag that to my new bin. Dragging it to the new bin does not remove it from its existing bin. It just adds it to this bin down here. That's one main effect we're going to work with. The other main effect is Luma Curve. I'll double click that to show you what it looks like. Scroll on down here a bit so you can see Luma Curve. Luma Curve has this graph here, and this is where you're going to adjust tonality to fix things like contrast and brightness. So I'll close that up a little bit there. Go back to Effects and drag Luma Curve down to your color correction. Now we could call it quits right now. Those are the two main guys. The rest of the guys we don't really need to work with. But there are a couple of real big effects here that you might want to work with down the road. And they're three-way color corrector, which is kind of the bigger effect than the fast color corrector, and RGB curves, which is a step up from the Luma Curve. Let me just show you the three-way color corrector. Double click on that. Open it up so you can see it. It has 3 color wheels that allow you to control color within the shadows, midtones, and highlights. It's much more precise. It gives you much more control. But it is kind of a big leap up from the fast color corrector. But if you want to try it out, definitely put it down in that group and occasionally open it up and see how it works. We're not going to work with this to any great detail in this chapter. Let's go back over to Effects and add that one to our group. So now we've got 3 down there. The other big guy is RGB Curves. RGB Curves looks a whole lot like Luma Curve, but it has more things in it. Here's the Luma Curve part of RGB Curves. This is the exact same thing that's inside Luma Curve without the rest of the stuff. But here you can control individual color channels in terms of their contrast and brightness. So this gives you some pretty precise control, and I will show you how to use this briefly when I also show you the 3-way color corrector. So back over here, we'll add RGB Curves down to our color correction group. So now we have 4 color correction effects inside this color correction group. The fast color corrector and Luma Curve, those are the guys we're going to work with a lot. And the RGB curves, the 3-way color corrector, these are the guys who sort of step up from both of these two guys. Again, we could kind of call it quits here, but I want to put a couple more in there that is kind of fun that can be used to do your secondary color correction where you're working on individual parts of a clip. One's change to color. That's where you take a color and turn it into some other color. So just drag that down to your color correction group like that. There you go. Another one is leave color. This is where you want to have a color stay in a clip and turn all the rest of the colors into grayscale. Drag that one down the color correction. Tint lets you put an overall color over a clip like sepia tone. So I'll drag that one down there too. And now we're going to leave the color correction group to move on down the line. I'm going to go to Generate. There's one cool one in there that I like to work with. I've shown it to you before. It's called Paint Bucket. This is where you select a color inside the clip. Try to get the entire color selected and then convert that to another color or some other kind of hue. It can be a lot of fun to do secondary color correction with that. We'll close Generate now and move on farther down the list. You'd think image control would be helpful, but we don't need these guys. Again, there's some more color correction things here, but we don't work with any of these folks here. I'll show you keying. Keying lets you key out a color, making it transparent. But the thing that we want to work with is something called the track matte key, because this is the thing that's really useful when you do secondary color correction and you're just selecting some area inside the clip to fix. So I'm going to add that to our group. And finally, I'm going to go to Transform. Crop is something that I use a lot when I do color correction. I crop an area and then let that area be the area that I want to check the color on to see if there's kind of a color cast. So I'm going to add crop down to color correction. So let's see what we've got inside there. 3, 6, 10 effects. All of which can be very helpful when you do color correction. But the main 2 guys that you're going to work with in the upcoming lessons are Luma Curve, Fast Color Corrector. So that's how I recommend you set up Premiere Pro when you do color correction. In the next lesson, we're going to take a closer look at these 2 scopes right here.